I mean, the narrative that Pakistan has achieved a major diplomatic victory in the recent ceasefire developments between the US, Iran, and indirectly, uh, I mean, Israel may sound appealing at the first glance, but guys, I feel that, but when we examine closely, uh, it does not hold up to a logical or a geopolitical scrutiny. At the very core, this claim rests on a very fundamental misunderstanding, and I would like to dwell into that misunderstanding in what way. And you see that there is a confusion of participation in a process with control over the outcome. So Pakistan at best functioned as a communication channel where they were the facilitator between the actors who either lacked the direct trust or required uh, an intermediary to keep the negotiations alive at a very critical moment. So if you see the but the fact that facilitation is not authorship, and the mediator passes the messages, it technically does not shape the intent, or they do not define the terms, or any kind of enforcement uh, uh, possibility is there in their result. So to describe this as a victory is akin to attributing the success of an agreement to the courier who delivered the final draft, rather than the parties who negotiated and compiled into a particular existence or a particular agreement. More importantly, it's not just about this fact. The narrative completely ignores the very structural forces that actually drove the ceasefire. People who are busy in hyping the Pakistan for having this mediation negotiation done, they forget the very lacuna, that they forget the very important nexus that has connected this whole graduation of having a ceasefire, which was technically did not lasted for even 4 hours. So the de-escalation was not born out of a diplomatic brilliance, but there was a strategic geopolitical compulsion, primarily that kind of triggered by the risk to a global energy stability, which centered around the Strait of Hormuz. So when a so with a significant portion of the world's oil supply were passing through these narrow corridors, any disruption or instantly which threatens the global markets, the trade flows, and the economic stability was technically pushing these leaders to come at one table. So once tension escalated to a point where this route was has become a risk, the response from major powers became very inevitable. So the United States needed to actually prevent a broader regional conflict and economic fallout. So Iran needed to avoid the full scale confrontation while preserving the strategic leverage. And China, as a major energy dependent economy, had a direct and a compelling interest in ensuring those stability. So, in such a scenario, you see the ceasefire becomes a very less product of a negotiation, but I feel that it is more of a necessity imposed by the structure of the global interdependence of the nations. So to attribute this outcome primarily to Pakistan is to overlook the very forces that made the ceasefire unavoidable in the first place. And additionally, if you see that any claim of a diplomatic win must be measured against the ability to influence the nation, let them or make them enforce a particular agreement, or sustain any outcome that Pakistan was already trying to wish for, but there was no wish or understanding. Pakistan in the situation possessed none of these attributes. It does not have the capacity to, enforce a ceasefire between major global actors. I mean, nor it can guarantee the compliance or deter the violations in any which ways. Neither they had a very pre-positioning of whole situation. So the real diplomatic power lies not in being present at the table, but always having the leverage to shape to leverage to shape the what happens after the agreement is signed. And this is where we as humans, technically in this whole setup, we forget that there is a role of large powers, and particularly China. I quoted just few days back about the Boomerang report, which is becomes very impossible to ignore. China's economic ties, the energy interest, and the kind of growing influence has in this region and position. It has far it is as far more consequential actor in ensuring that any de-escalation holds. By contrast, the Pakistan's remains role remains very limited to the facilitation, important which was important just for a procedural sense, but that was not that decisive in a strategic one, which we BBC earlier day was claiming it. I know they do it for certain views and certain thought and process. But elevating its role while downplaying or ignoring those dynamic is not just incomplete analysis. I would feel that it is analytically very flawed. So the context in which Pakistan has stepped in further, weakens the very claim of a grand diplomatic triumph. Uh, if I go historically, traditionally, the mediation in such conflict is undertaken by the regional actors, which was done whether with Qatar or Egypt, which maintains a degree of neutrality, and they have established a diplomatic channel over a period of time. However, in this instance, many of these states were themselves exposed to the risk of escalation. Qatar was at risk, Egypt was at risk, Lebanon was at risk, Arab countries were at risk. So when you yourself have been exposed to the risk of escalation, so they cannot act as a neutral intermediaries technically. So this created a temporary vacuum, and Pakistan stepped in to fill it. But filling a gap is not same as commanding the influence or the outcome or enforceability of such an agreement. It was not a rise born out of a strategic dominance, and Pakistan was doing it from a very long period of time. But there was a moment of relevance, that created by circumstances. So such roles are often transient, and I feel that it is very mistaking. We are mistaking them for a long-term geopolitical elevation leads to overestimation and kind of eventually credibility issues also. And this is precisely where the narrative begins to unravel. The initial claims of a sweeping diplomatic success were soon met with contradictions, differing interpretations, and there was a lack of clarity regarding the scope and terms of the ceasefire. Now, this pattern reflects a very classic problem in the international relations, which says that the overstatement leading to scrutiny and scrutiny exposing the limitations, which says that when a role is exaggerated beyond its actual scope, it technically invites the closer examination, and that examination often reveals the gap between the perception and the reality. So, in this gap, the gap is very significant. Parallel to this, the argument that India was somehow sidelined in this process, which BBC on the earlier day was claiming, which again reflects a misunderstanding of how the modern diplomacy operates. India's approach in all these such situations has consistently been guided by strategic restraint, and there is a long-term calculation, I feel, because by avoiding the direct entanglement in a volatile regional conflict, India preserved its relationship across multiple axes while they were trying to safeguard our own economic and energy interest. In diplomacy, visibility is not always a marker of influence, and often the most effective strategies are those that operate without drawing any attention. So we need to understand that India's measured was very silent, and therefore should not be read as absence, but there was always a deliberate choice to avoid the unnecessary exposure in a conflict where its core interests were not directly at stake. So when all these elements are considered together, if you see, a clear and a rational picture can emerge. So the ceasefire was driven by a structural pressures, which was shaped by a major powers, and the stabilized by actors with which had the real leverage. So Pakistan's role was not insignificant, but was limited to a facilitating communication within the larger framework. It was technically useful, but it was not decisive. Presently it may seem very powerful, but to elevate this role into a grand diplomatic victory is to blur the distinction between a process and the power, and between the participation and the control. Ultimately, the hype surrounding the Pakistan's role is illogical, because if you see that it confuses the facilitation with influence. Irrational because it is also irrational because it ignores the deeper geopolitical forces at play, and uncalled for because it inflates a situational contribution into a claim of strategic success. A more grounded understanding would recognize that in global politics. So we have few questions over here. I can deal with that. The first question I have, that what is, I'm just saying in one line, that is facilitation versus power. Where is the line? So see, yes, a trusted intermediary is a form of power. I genuinely understand that, but it is a specific kind of power. If you get a chance, please read Joseph Nye. He's a political scientist who distinguishes between the hard power, soft power, and the smart power. In hard power, he talks about the coercion, what Americas and the likes of America, the Chinas do. The coercion, the enforcement, they have the capacity to enforce their whole objective through the subsidiaries that they have built over a period of time, like UN. The soft power, they have the ability to persuade. There is a legitimacy into what we fall part of, so there is a legitimacy, there is a persuasion, there is a good person, good man signature, and then there is a smart power, which is a combination of both coercion and the persuasion. And mediation falls under the procedural or the soft power, but not it is not a structural power. And if you read the Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy, he reads it. I mean, he explains this whole situation. And if you ever get a chance, why these people are fooling you by hyping it up, you read Henry Kissinger. He says that the intermediary can shape the tone of the negotiation, but that is not the necessity of that whole situation. This would have done ideal by someone else, if not Pakistan. So where is the line? The mediator becomes meaningful when it when he has or she has a job beyond a courier. So technically, they have the responsibility to frame the proposals. They have the control over sequencing of talks. They have the build. They have built trust over a period of time. They have influenced the concessions indirectly. And all these four criteria, Pakistan does not fit into even one. They do not have the ability to propose the frameworks. They did not have the sequencing control over the talks. There was no trust built over time. I mean, there was no influence which was concession as directly. So, but it becomes a decisive power only when they can impose a cost for non-compliance or guarantee outcomes. So the conclusion is that it is a meaningful facilitation, but it is not authorship. It is not a decisive authorship. Second, we have that, are we undervaluing the mediators like Qatar? So take Qatar as a benchmark. Qatar's mediation in US Taliban or Israel Hamas, they have built years long trust infrastructure. They have hosted negotiations continuously over a period of time. They have maintained the parallel access to all sides. So I was just reading about William Zartman. He explained this whole situation as he is a technical conflict resolution expert. He says that the mediation succeeds not when it speaks, but when it is accepted as indispensable. But that means there is no other option. There is no other means. There is no other ways that you can put this thing or put or carve down this whole situation. So the key difference is that Qatar is a very institutional mediator, long term, trusted, embedded in a whole countries. So there is a lot to understand just by we cannot understand by just by hyping up. Third question is that, can a state claim the partial credit without control? Yes, but there is only limit. International relation theory allows for contributory credit. So what you can do is that you can create a back channel talks. You can intervene with the timings. You can reduce with the misperception. But Thomas Schelling, the strategy of conflict, reminds us a very good thing. He says that outcomes are determined where incentives converge, but not where messages pass. So logically, Pakistan can claim the participatory credit for something which was going to happen, but there is no determinative credit that you can give it to them, and there is a nuance to it. Uh, Also, the question with respect to the structural forces versus the diplomatic agency, and this is the most important tension. If you see, the structural forces like the Strait of Hormuz crisis creates a pressure to act in any which ways. You have to act today or tomorrow. You have to act, but diplomacy determines when, how, and on what terms. So who did what? Structure, they made the ceasefire necessary. Diplomacy made ceasefire possible. Pakistan role fits here because it does not create the need, but it helped unlock the timing and communication bottleneck. So, many ask that why it did take 39 days, because see, in geopolitics, intent is not equal to trust. Even in both the sides wanted a de-escalation, they needed a face saving language. They needed a credibility, credible deniability of whole situation. They need the non hostile channels that can come into as a picture for being a courier of their message. you know uh, Many people ask, why didn't China mediate directly? Because you see, the excellent contradiction, which is excellent contradiction to this whole test. China avoids any kind of overt mediation because it prefers a low visibility in such influences. It avoids being seen as taking the sides publicly. It does not believe in taking side, and it does not want to take sides, because the idea is to always be hidden and then choose an action, and that is best done by the China. John Meshmar, he was a realist in jurisprudence. He says that the great powers minimize the unnecessary exposure while maximizing the structural advantage, and that is why China is best at doing this. So China technically provides the back end pressure. They are using their intermediaries for front end diplomacy, and of course Pakistan becomes a very buffer layer. uh, Fifth, what is enforcement and leverage, and who actually has it? US has military plus sanctions. Iran has regional escalation capability. China has economic leverage. I mean, Pakistan has none of them. But here's a nuance here, which the questioner has raised, that yes, being a weaker actor can be an advantage because it allows face-saving diplomacy. It appears less threatening. So this aligns with the honest broker theory, Dalal wala theory, and that is why S. J. Shankar, gave the line of Dalal, because we are not Dalals of two countries. We are not going to intervene in some things which are not directly at stake. So Pakistan's strength was acceptable neutrality, and there is no enforceability to the whole authority. They were asked to do that whole situation, and they were doing it. I mean, has anybody, what is vacuum, what is skill? I again say that there is where the critique must be fair. Filling the vacuum does require skill, diplomatic readiness, readiness, strategic positioning, quick response. But it is, kind of I would say the best you can say, it was an opportunistic success. That's it, and not more than that. If anything you want to say. Uh, I mean, is it unique to Pakistan? No. Every state exaggerates. US frames outcomes as leadership. Iran frames them as resistance success. Others frame them as diplomatic wins. But you see that this differs only for Pakistan when it overclaims the risk. There is a credibility erosion, mismatch with reality, and also there is a future exclusion from serious mediation. So Kissinger always says the same thing. In diplomacy, credibility once stretched becomes very difficult to restore. What about India? So both interpretations are valid. Strategic restraint because avoid they we want to avoid the entanglement. We are learning from China of how they are trying to preserve their multi-alignment and what protects them in the long interest. But we also missed an opportunity to increase the visibility. Could have signaled a regional leadership. But the truth is hybrid. India chose the risk minimization over influence maximization. So that was the right option. I would feel. I mean, I would say, if you see from the thought of realism versus liberalism, the narrative lens, realist talks about realism means power and the material capability to perform that power. Liberalism says that process, institutions, mediation matters. So, structure of any country determines the very outcome more than any intentions that they're trying to put forth. But liberals on the other side would say the institution and intermediaries reduce the conflict cost. So the balanced view would be something between the structure which creates a limit and agency which operates within those limits. So yeah, that is something, make it as whole. I can analyze this whole situation.